All right, so I want to thank everyone for coming to our panel. This is the last panel of the day, so it's the home stretch. And I think we have a really great panel for you. It's called Making a COSS Play. Let me know, can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. Making a COSS Play. Now, there won't be any costumes on our panel, but we will be exploring how to commercialize open source. I think that's something a lot of people here are really interested in. I also want to introduce our panel. So first, let me just do this real quick. So we've got the pictures. So we're going to start here. First, we have Dirk Riehle. He's a professor of open source at FAU Erlangen, a large public university in Germany. They either research commercial open source business models or create, fund, and lead the corresponding startups. Next, we have Heather Meeker. She is a specialist in open source licensing. She is a partner at Tech Law Partners, LLC, or LLP, a law firm focused on technology transactions. She's also co-founder of Chinstrap Community, a resource center for investors and founders starting commercial open source businesses. She is also an alumni of UC Berkeley. Or UC Berkeley Law School. So yay, Berkeley. And one thing I want to say about Chinstrap Community, it's a really great community if you are interested in doing any kind of commercial open source. There are classes for different types, depending on where you sit, like if you're a developer, if you're an attorney, that kind of thing. So it's a good thing to check out. Next, we have Joel Kehle. Okay, great. And Joel is a business development officer at UCLA Technology Development Group, where he manages a portfolio of database, algorithms, artificial intelligence, bioinformatics, and other computer science technologies. So really good there. And then our final panelist is Mike Cohen. You might have heard him a little bit this morning. He is the Director of Innovation Ecosystem Development. He drives initiatives and agreements that catalyze the commercialization of UC Berkeley innovations and support of funding campus research. In this role, Mike has worked with hundreds of startups and has spearheaded the commercialization of over 100 innovations in numerous areas, including software and AI models. And for those of you who are here this morning, Mike did speak a little bit during one of the question and answer portions of a panel. All right, so let's get started. So the first question, you may be asking is what business models, first question is how can an individual or company make money from commercial open source software? So Heather, do you want to start?
Yeah, so let's see. Okay. So you see a picture here of a car, but it's not put together. Okay, so the question I have for you is, suppose you need a car, and I told you, I'll give you this for free. But if you want the car put together, you have to pay $30,000, okay? Would you take this car? And the answer is surely, no, I would not take that car. I wouldn't take the car because A, I don't know how to put it together. B, if I did put it together, it probably wouldn't be right. I couldn't get anybody to maintain it. It might not be street legal, and on and on and on. Okay, so this is the quintessential metaphor for how to make money with open source software. The open source software is the car part. It is not the final product. And when people buy things from businesses, they buy final products. And by the way, I have shamelessly stolen this metaphor from Bob Young, who was one of the founders of Red Hat. He figured out that people would pay for a finished product, even if the pieces of the product were free. And whenever you look at a company that is making money around open source, a COSS company, what they're doing is they're selling the delta between these pieces and the finished product. And that can take a lot of different forms, but when you start thinking about COSS, you need to start thinking about what am I actually selling and what is the difference between that and a whole bunch of source code that I make available for free.
Thank you. Mike, did you want to add that?
Well, the only thing I would add or maybe just emphasize is it's not just a product, it's a whole solution. And when you're selling a B2B, when you're selling to enterprises, they want the complete solution. It's not just the software, it's the support, it's the data compliance, it's the data security, and it's the onboarding, it's all that really you're offering these vendors. So that's why making money in the selling B2B, selling to enterprises is much more successful with open source than doing it with B2C to just consumer apps.
Okay.
Yeah, what you're selling to people is solving a problem for them, right? Not here's some source code. Like that's not a solution to their problem.
Okay. So what business models do you find to be the most successful or unsuccessful with respect to cost? Heather, I think.
Well, I would say the one that was kind of the granddaddy of all of them, but is not terribly successful today, is just like the maintenance and support model. And Red Hat's kind of the quintessential example of that, but I would point out that they're still very successful, and what they're really selling is quality control and solving a problem, like Mike mentioned. But people who think, okay, I made this software and I'm going to make a business out of supporting it, that's not an investable business because it is too much human resources involved and so forth. If you want to start a business that is going to be very successful and investable by people who would put money into it, you need to have a business that usually has a core of open source software and then extra bells and whistles that you add. And people call that open core, although that can mean a lot of different things. I would say that almost all of the companies that are coming out the door today in the commercial open source area are some variation of open core. There are a lot of other variations too. I could talk all day about it, I won't, but that is probably the most common one today. There's some open source software, it has some core functionality, and what you're selling to people is not that core, you're selling to them these so-called enterprise features like, you know, delivering it up in a nice bow, security, hosting, sign-on, regulatory approval, and so forth and so on.
And Dirk, did you have anything?
Yep, yeah, I wanted to offer a slightly alternative framing of this, where in my experience with specifically then venture capital funded commercial open source startups, the business idea comes first, and then people recognize that going to market with an open source strategy, meaning having a proprietarily developed product and then open sourcing some of it, is a viable way forward. And then the business model is just a regular business model where open source is part of the strategy, and how you make money, to come around, is then by identifying the difference between what you make available as open source for free, no money and free, but in what I call the closed complement, the thing you do not make away for free because that's what you want your customers to pay for. In open core, it was somehow enterprise extensions. It could be completely complementary software or a service. Typically these days it is running some software in the cloud at lower cost than you could do it yourself if you took the open source software. Increasingly, it's holding the data private and giving the software available for free. The key is always some or all of the software is made available as open source, in addition to also a proprietary license, and something is just not made available for free. And the combined package has the maximum value for the customer, and which is why they're buying.
Okay, thank you. Just one follow-up for you, Heather. So you mentioned, support. What about consultancy? Do you, consider that the same thing, or do you consider it a successful model or something that's a little bit more difficult?
Well, so as an investor, I wouldn't invest in a consultancy. I mean, it's great business if you want a job, right? But it's not the kind of business that you would get investors to invest in. In order to get investors interested in your business, it needs to have the characteristics where you can leverage something that you've done, and without a bunch of additional costs, you can make additional sales and revenue. Consultancy is, well, I'm a lawyer, right? And law is the ultimate like consultancy business, right? You actually have to pay each person to do the work. And so the more work you do, the more costs you have. Any kind of business that is mainly professional services, it's a great business to, to be in personally, but you would not expect outside investors to invest in that kind of business model.
Okay, thank you. So for the panel, or I think Mike, you're going to start off, kick us off on this one, is when should you consider making a COSS play? Like, what are the factors, what are the objectives that people should be thinking about?
Well, assuming that you're coming from the university environment, maybe, I don't know if I should make that assumption in this audience, but let's just say, okay, so you're you're an individual part of a team that's put together a is this not working? Yeah, it might not, maybe closer. How's that? Oh yeah, I can hear that much better. Yeah. So where was I? Oh yeah. So you're an individual part of the team. You're developing some software, and you want to open source it. You got to think about whether you want to just put it out there for the public domain, or whether you want to try to commercialize it, make some money on it, perhaps even spin out a company and get venture capital. A lot of it depends on when it happens at Berkeley and they come to my office and people like me. First we discuss what their objectives are. Some teams, the research teams, the faculty just want to remain faculty. The grad students just want to go into academia. They're not interested in commercializing it. And so we just put it out there, public domain, and then they create a community. That's a whole other topic. But sometimes, for example, the postdocs or grad students, they want to spin out a company. And so we talk about the different business models for that. For example, they can open source it and then produce an enterprise grade version of it to sell. Or sometimes we've even, dare I say in this audience, we've even patented some elements of it or just copyrighted it and exclusively licensed it to these companies. And the reason is sometimes there's an advantage, there's a time to market advantage to having a little bit of an exclusive license. And so sometimes the algorithms are very valuable. So there's a whole range here, but just getting back to the fundamental question, a lot of it depends on your objectives and what the market and business potential is. Even if you want to spin out something to make money, but if the open source software just inherently doesn't have a big market, or maybe is conducive just to consulting and not scaling a business, even if you want to make money out of it, you're not gonna, it's not the right thing to do. So a lot of it, again, it depends on the technology, the objectives, and the market.
Okay, thank you. So Dirk, what circumstances make sense for making cosplay?
Yes, so the word commercial open source is actually a marketing term. I think it was invented around 2004 by Clint Oram of Sugar CRM, which was a commercial open source firm, but they invented it because they made their proprietary product available on an open source license, part of their strategy. And users back then thought, oh, it's open source, can't be good quality. So that has changed, but the key insight here is what you also already said, that you need to think about the business first, and then open source can become a strategy. Now, here, despite what we just said, we are probably coming exactly the other way around. We love some piece of open source software that we've invested our blood and sweat and tears in and would like to do something with it. Well, the bad news is it's not necessarily possible. It really depends. So here are 3 situations where it could work, where you started with open source and now need to retrofit a business on top of it. The first is to look at the domain, I think. So quite obviously to me, so one example domain is developer infrastructure and tools. Software developers love, breathe open source. It's very natural to them. They just expect it, and you would be at a disadvantage if you don't have a clear open source strategy. Here I noticed, of course, scientists. They have a similar approach. I'm not sure you could reach a PR agency if that was your market this way. Another aspect is digital sovereignty. So in particular in Europe, or maybe probably everywhere else but the US, there's a significant drive in gaining more sovereignty over the software you use. So that ties back to open source and on-premise operations, and all of that is an advantage over well, a proprietary closed cloud or so. And the third example was, I forgot my third example. How is that? So the key insight again is if you can think about the business first and then decide whether an open source strategy is the right one for you. It could just be that it's not, but hopefully it is.
Can I make a comment? Like, I actually think in the developer tool market right now, it's very difficult to sell something that is not open source because there's such a high expectation among developers that their tools are going to be open source.
But I would like to add, to be a business still, it's still a strategy. Open source is not a business model. Yes. So the strategy has to be, here's something we make available, and it must be useful software, but there's still that close complement, what people pay for, because if you give that away for free, you have no business.
Heather, were you going to comment?
No, that's it.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one more framing to this, and it's very much in line with what everyone's saying, but it's a tool more than it is an answer. And that's that if you think of a market as an exchange of value, in a commercial market, you're exchanging something for cash. And so I think one of the ways that you can think about this is if you look at what you will be getting from open sourcing, whether that is some kind of credibility, some kind of user base, on and on and on. It's probably, depending on the fact pattern, different. What you should ask yourself is, if I do that, does that help me create a moat for the commercial market? And that's a framing that I think can add value.
I have one quick question. When we met before, there was a comment and I just wanted to follow up on it. Is open source a way to break into a difficult market? So a market that might already be impacted and you make open, yeah.
It was my third point, so thanks for letting me jump in. Okay, sorry. Yeah, it's exactly a disruptive situation or innovator's dilemma situation. There's a strong incumbent with a closed source product. Then open source, a commercial open source strategy may be your only chance. The key insight here, and that's completely underappreciated even among those practitioners or experts of commercial open source, is it's an added benefit. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable how often that gets ignored. If you make your software available under an open source license, then it's an added benefit. You don't need okay, that's clear. You don't need escrow agreements or anything. Customers can feel good buying. But the thing is, even in sales, your product should be more expensive than a equivalent closed source product, because you have that added benefit of being open source, which translate into some sorts of insurance of you will not price gouge your customers. So it's really a benefit how it's a better software ultimately play. It doesn't translate, it's the sales paradox of commercial open source. It doesn't translate in higher price points, weirdly, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah, I would also point out, you probably would agree with this, but if you're going to create a business and say, we are the open source X, right, where X is something proprietary, that's probably not going to be enough. You have to actually also have a great business. I think there are many reasons why having your core code be open source is a benefit for having a great business, but marketing your business as the open source alternative to X is great, but it's probably not going to be enough to create a really good business.
Okay, on to the next question. Is how can the university community share in COSS prosperity? Things like, spin-outs, ecosystems, trends. So Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Well, this is a big topic, especially at UC Berkeley. Interestingly, during the Linux talk today, Naya, the first three examples she gave of UC Berkeley spin-outs, the first one was Spark and Databricks. Second one was RISC-V and Sci-5, and the third was, I think, Ray and Anyscale. You know how much UC Berkeley made on all those spin-outs that are worth billions and billions of dollars? Exactly, zero.
Do you count what the alumni gave back to the university?
That's discretionary at any time. So this is a bigger topic, but I'll just mention it. So we've worked over the last several years to create some agreements. One of them is called the Open Source Software Good Standing Agreement, and it's called OS3. You can just do a search on UC Berkeley OS3. And that agreement, what basically does is it allows those spin-outs to say they're in good standing with the university, and in return they give us 1% equity and 1% participation rights in their future funding rounds. So there's no cash, and it's not obligatory, but it's part of the culture that we're building now at the campus to give back. Because as a lot of people know, universities, University of California and Berkeley in particular, we have a lot of budget problems. Yet we're creating all this wealth, all this in the economy, and so we're trying to participate in ways that are more contractual instead of discretionary.
Yeah, I know that there are other universities who are doing similar things. They have programs for like all you can eat open source, we get like 1% or whatever. So I actually think that's a good model. As if the universities stay with you're going to get patents and pay like, royalties for exclusive licenses, they're never going to participate in open
Yeah, we're not trying to discourage the open source community or the mindset which has been so successful. We're just trying to, in a very amicable way, try to participate in it. And by the way, when you have participation rights, that means we're investing in the companies alongside the other investors, so it's still kind of a win-win. I'll say one more thing though. Despite all that, there's a huge gain to the campus, in the community, for just all the open source success, and it drives a lot of talent. And those are other ways that the campus community benefits from that aren't monetary. So we definitely acknowledge that.
How about you, Joel? I think you had wanted to talk about ecosystems and alignment.
Yeah, well, I had a couple of different thoughts on this, and one is something I cleared because it's a shameless plug, and that's direct participation. So as someone in tech transfer recently, I created a agentic tool for decision analysis, and all the other campuses have tech transfer offices. And so the idea is that we will all be participating in developing this tool, which will help us do our jobs better. And the UC is not the only tech transfer, not the only institution or set of institutions that have tech transfer. So we're possibly building out a tool collectively that could add value to all of the campuses, not only in our daily operations, but possibly as an asset that we can monetize. Another form of direct participation is if someone is a student, or actually a grad student or even postdoc, participating in what is, at least within the confines of the UC system, effectively an open source project, is really, as many people have said today, it's a great way to build your network. It's a great way to get mentorship. It's a great way to learn about software and about subject matter that you might not normally be exposed to. So yeah, I think if, especially at the UC, it's just a rich environment to create these cross-campus cosplays, let's do that, and have everyone participate, both in administration and students. The other is really the more classic ecosystem play, that if you are aware that someone is building something, software or business is not an island, and if you're doing something innovative, chances are, if the cosplay is doing something innovative, chances are there is a business opportunity around that that can be monetized, and you can coordinate with that team and figure out what that is.
Okay, Heather, did you want anything to add on this one? Nope. Okay, just want to make sure. All right, so for Joel, what do you wish individuals knew prior to releasing code?
I wish they knew the name of someone in their tech transfer office. And my story for that, even though I have a few categories I want to go through, is just this last week, a researcher reached out to me, and they did a disclosure, which was great, and there was software, there were some data sets, and they were very eager to start a company. And the data sets had already been put on Zenodo, and I looked, and they were Creative Commons licenses, which was great, and they allowed people to use these and use them commercially, which was great. Not, because it turns out that the data set that this was built on it has to do with patient data, and so it very strictly, as of today, has no commercial rights. And so we now have this interesting situation where I'm like, okay, companies are seeing Zenodo assert that they can take these and run a business on them, and then they can get sued. And now is the UC liable for this? So this is one of a zillion one of these complicated, nuanced things that talking to someone in tech transfer can save everybody a lot of headaches and really protect your interest. So the three areas that, there's a lot more of these, but I thought of was this one, which I would label as downstream obligations. There's the more classic encumbrances. And usually you would think that a PI would be very clear on what their funding is, but sometimes that could be very complicated, and certainly the students aren't as clear. And all of the restrictions or all the encumbrances vary. Sometimes someone won't allow an exclusive license. Other times it has to be open source. Other times it has to be closed source. There are all sorts of flavors. And we are here to read through all the fine print so that you don't have to. And then the last one of these is the problem of evolving case law. By training, I'm a computer scientist. I was shocked when I came into this field to understand that the law changes all the time. And a recent, I have a colleague that reached out to me from another school, because it turns out that the Berkeley 3-clause license, which is UCLA's preferred license, if someone truly has an open source requirement, there is now a debate going on whether the license remaining silent on patent grants is affirmative or not. And so as of 2 weeks ago, we are now thinking we are going to change to the BSD 3-clause clear license, which is very specific about the fact that it is not a patent grant. And why should someone as a researcher need to know that? So I would say it's complicated, so please reach out to your tech transfer office so that you already know someone and then they happily have a discussion with you. That's
Okay, great.
Could I make a comment about this? There's one thing I want anyone who's thinking about commercializing open source to know, and that they usually don't think about, and that is branding, and branding, right? If you want to make a business build a business based on open source software, you have to think very carefully about what you're calling the software and whether you consider that a brand or not. Because when you get down the road and you're starting to, manage your business, if you treat the name of your project as a brand, you're going to be in a very different position than if you did not. And so there is a tendency of people, understandable, to use generic names for open source software and to also just kind of use crazy names and offhand kind of naming. But if you're interested, and that's all fine if you're not interested in a business, but if you're interested in a business, fast forward to several years later when you're really trying to sell this in the marketplace, you're now in a position of defending a brand that may be undefendable or may be inappropriate. So think carefully about what you're calling things.
Oh, yes, go.
So I teach a course across German universities of 12 workshops on how to turn your research work as a PhD student, so not bachelor, master, but really PhD student, into a startup. The unusual thing is it is aligned with the trajectory of a 4-year degree program. So the workshops really are spaced out in time rather than it's crunch time within a few weeks or a few months. The very second workshop is about intellectual property, and I would like to add or emphasize that you shouldn't even just wait until you want to open source something. I would recommend TTOs proactively reach out. The decision to open source or commercialize often comes rather late and is not necessarily planned, and may already have led you into much of hot water or trouble. So trademarks, I think, are one thing, but just the mixing up of copyright can be a disaster, more so in Germany than here, I'm being told, but students have so many moral rights. If you don't get the paperwork in order for the IP, it's basically impossible to commercialize that work 3 years into a project.
Thank you. So I'm going to take it back to the audience in a way, is that you know, we have a lot of researchers, students here with the UC community. So if they're looking to make a cosplay, what should they do? I think it's been answered in part, but I just want to emphasize it. So Joel or Mike, do you want to say what you'd like?
Well, the only thing I'll add to what Joel said, which is confer with your tech transfer people, is UCOP website has if you do a search on UCOP open source, it's a great website on best practices for university people and considering open source, including a nice table that describes all the many of the standard open source licenses and which ones are optimal. Because as some of the previous panels discussed today, some of the open source licenses, they're patent granting, like the GPL 3.0. And so if you work for the University of California, Berkeley, and you're releasing software under the GPL 3 or patent granting license, that means you've encumbered all the other UC campuses that may have patents. And so that's why that website is a great example. Another one is, you know, some of the open source licenses are hereditary, and sometimes that's good, sometimes it isn't. So again, that's the only thing. One more thing I would add, though, in contrast to the German universities, maybe, what we found at least at UC Berkeley is it's more about just-in-time information. When we have new faculty and postdocs and grad students coming in, we have webinars for them and things that they can learn a lot about. But they're inundated with all this information about the university and their own research. And so really, when they want to know most about IP is when they're ready to disclose or release or do something with their software. And so a lot of it's timing. And yeah, so that's the challenge.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Joe? No?
That was great. I'm good.
All right. One thing I'll add is UCOP also has a copyright policy website. That's something that would be good for you guys to check out to see, you know, when you own your work, when the university owns the work, or when your grant funder might own the work. Because, you know, ownership, all of it begins with ownership, right? Because if you don't own it, you can't license it.
Yeah, you might want to read your employee invention assignment agreement before making any big decisions.
All right, so I kind of stepped out of bounds there, but I hope it's okay. So now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes.
Hi, thanks. That was great discussion. I wanted to follow up on something that Dirk said. Dirk was talking about Sugar CRM. And one of the things that happened to Sugar CRM is that in India, a company called Tiger CRM took the source code as is, and they started a business with exactly the same business model as Sugar CRM had in North America. And they were successful. But Sugar CRM learned a lesson from this, which is, you know, you can't just put the open source out there. So in fact, the Sugar CRM changed their license. And we've seen a lot of license changes more recently because of the cloud computing issues. But I wanted to, you know, put that out as a, let's say, a warning to others who might just want to throw it out there over the fence and hope for the best.
Thank you.
Well, that's the free market. But also, it's another lesson there is that IP laws are only as good as the courts in a country. You know, and if you can't enforce IP rights in a country like China or Russia or perhaps in parts of India, then, you know, the IP rights are useless. And yeah, it's a whole other topic.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah,
So
sure.
I was talking to the CEO of a business I'm on the board for. It's a commercial open source business. And I was talking to him about this issue. And he said to me, if someone else could take our source code and duplicate our business, we've got a crappy business. And he's right. You know, I mean, it's not an unimportant consideration, and you have to take it into account in how you're building your business. But I would just emphasize that having access to source code is not a business. A business is a lot more than that. And if your business is easily reproducible like that, you're probably not doing enough to make your business into a good business. So you have to really think carefully about what you're doing to add value to whatever source code you're releasing.
This is actually a very timely topic. people know about this SaaS apocalypse. This is
Yeah.
very, very relevant to the open source community. A lot of the very successful SaaS companies, including the CRM companies, all their stocks have tremendously decreased because there's this hypothesis that vibe coding and AI in general is going to make it really easy to replace like the Salesforces and the Adobe software, and it has really crushed their stock. But as we're pointing out here, those kind of companies are way more than just their software. However, what is changing is, you know, if you want to talk about the detailed business model, they're moving from a seat-based business model to like more of a token-based business model, and that's going to crush their margins. So it's just going to reset their you know, the multiples.
Well, I would also say that if your SaaS application makes your users do things that are extremely annoying to interact with it, they are going to go to the general AI models and create something that is easier to use. And I think a lot of these businesses that are, you know, squawking about the dangers of AI taking over and taking their business away, they have been, I'll just be blunt, a little bit lazy for too long about the usability issues of their products. If you have a product that's really good and is specifically for a kind of application, I would rather keep using that than use like a general AI model or something that I coded with a general AI model, because I'm going to have more faith in your product than I would in something that is more general. But if your product is hard for me to use, I'm absolutely going to abandon it and use Claude or something that I coded.
Hi, I'm Henrik Bengtsson at UCSF. I'm a scientist, I'm faculty there. I've been doing it for 25 years. So I think we have different types of open source communities. I would not be able to do my research or my collaborators' research if it wouldn't be open source from day one. The worst thing you can do is someone publishes statistical methods in medicine or genomics or something, and they do not release what they do. They go talk about this, amazing results, and the community trying to do their methods, but they can't do it. So I see like a tension with if you say, be careful going open source too soon, you have to have an idea if you want to go business later. And I think most of us working in these fields, where it's open source from day one. And we also have, it's not one institute, it's like multiple institutes across the world. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Heather, I would definitely love for you to, well, anyone on the panel to add, but as someone in tech transfer office, when I hear what you have told me, I'm not hearing a cosplay. And our office very early on adopted source available licenses to encourage research. And when I say adopted, I should say made available. And then when I explain to researchers that these are licenses which allow all of their colleagues, regardless of where they are in the world, to have access to reproduce data, to contribute, et cetera, but if there's commercial value, we might be able to license it and pay for one of your grad students. They all pick that license. And so I put what I just heard into a very different bucket than how can I use open source as part of a strategy to break into a market. This is scientific research, which is all of the UC's mission, and we take it very seriously, and we try to provide the tools to support that.
I have one small follow-up in that. So the people that have successful open source software. So all these open source software and communities that are very successful, and they can't really, from the governance, create a company because they're like so spread out, but they're looking for ways to find funding. Do you have any ideas how you could commercialize it to sustain the project, but not become the big? Can I refine what Joe said? So I think it's really helpful to look at a fundamental distinction here in open source, one which I would call community open source versus commercial open source. The type of open source you've probably been talking about is one that's communally developed. There's shared copyright among a lot of people, which means there's exactly one license, and if you have to convince the whole community if you want any changes. With that as a base, so open source came first. It doesn't belong a particular company. Now what you can have is an ecosystem of vendors around it. The type of business model they can build, given that open source came first, is not VC ready, like labor-based consulting. It could be, if the complexity is very high, distributor-like. So the example was the car I loved, but it's really one type of business model, in my opinion, which are the distributors which take the complexity of arranging 10,000 pieces that need to fit together for you. So that works with community open source. When we talked about commercial open source here, at least my assumption was what in the Silicon Valley or in this region here counts as commercial open source is really a company, often venture capital funded, has a business idea, develops the software, closed doors. It's all paid labor by the company, and then they open source some or all of it. A very different intellectual property situation, very different way of commercializing. They open source with a clear idea, which may be wrong later on, but they have at least a clear idea at the beginning of how they think they make money by, again, what's the close complement, what is it that customers pay for. So very different situation. You're trying to retrofit into a community open source situation. Some business models may or may not work. Your choice of business strategies, in my opinion, is already limited to some extent. Doesn't have to mean it doesn't work, but it's somewhat limited.
Okay, the great thing about the maturity of the open source industry is how many approaches there are between what you're doing and what some of the things you're describing. And I'll give you a great example. It's called Open Seas. If you do a search on Open, SEES, developed at UC Berkeley, Civil Environmental Engineering. It's finite element analysis to do earthquake analysis on construction projects. So the software was open sourced for research, educational, and nonprofit purposes, but not for commercial use. And so now there's a huge community of people improving that automobile, that software for research, education, nonprofit. And then there's a whole nother community of companies that have non-exclusively licensed the software for commercial use, and they're putting it into their full enterprise-grade solutions. So there you have both worlds working together. And so it really, there's a lot of ways to do this, and it really depends on all the nuances of the technology, the authors, the market, and so forth.
Maybe make one more comment based on something that Joel mentioned. There are licenses that are not open source licenses. They are, you call them source available. I think that's the right term for them. They make things available, but not for any purpose you want. For any purpose you want is one of the fundamental assumptions of open source licensing. So there's a difference between openness in the sense of free software or open source. That's one idea. And then there's the concept of openness in terms of transparency and scientific credibility and so forth. And those are not always the same thing, right? And so I deal with clients all the time who really kind of get those things mixed up. But you have to think about each of those things separately. And if what you want is transparency, but you don't want information or software just made available for any use, for any purpose, that's when you go to one of these other kinds of licenses.
Yeah, I think this is a great discussion. I think it just goes back to what you guys were saying earlier. It's about your objective. What is it you're really trying to accomplish? And then your TTO can really help you on that. Any more questions? Last question then, I guess.
Okay,
Sorry.
hi. My name's Zahida, and this one's for Heather. It's regarding the image on the screen there. And you said that depicted open source. Having worked in open source for about 3 decades almost, I find that quite offensive. Because I guess the people here, a lot of the folks here, have been involved in open source for a while, but I think it's not a good analogy because, that kind of implies that all those different parts, unless you have commercial, open source doesn't work, right?
Oh, no, that's not what I meant to imply. You could take that car and put it together and make it available for free. You would that wouldn't be a business. So I'm sorry if it was offensive.
No, it's like, would you take this car for free? And this was open source.
Yeah, you
that's what you get, right?
That
and there's
is-
plenty of open source software out there that's easily downloadable and functioning and working. So
That's absolutely true. There's a shall we say, a spectrum between things that are just tools to build products and things that are finished products. And there are plenty of great open source products, but if you are going to maintain a product, you need resources. And one of the ways that you create resources is private funding. Another way is volunteer efforts. That is funding from the hearts and souls and extra hours of people. And another is government funding, and there's Linux Foundation funding and so forth. If you're going to have a finished product and keep it robust, you need resources, not just source code.
So
And
I guess
I'm on-
that's a better way of putting it, as opposed to it needs to be commercial. Because I think
No,
if
it's
you're,
not
if you're
actually what I said. What I said was you wouldn't pay for a car that was in pieces. It is a metaphor to show the difference between the value of parts and the value of a finished product.
And I guess my point was it's not, open source is not just parts. So if the audience was a new audience, that's how they would see this. And
Okay,
that
my
wouldn't be
apologies.
appropriate.
My
I
apologies.
just wanted to correct it. So if this got used again, it was clear.
Okay, my
Thanks.
apologies.
Thanks, Heather.
I am being told no. I'm so sorry. If you want to come up. All right. You can always come up later. Yeah. All right. So again, I want to thank everyone in our panels for attending and participating. I think they did a great job. I hope you all learned something new or something more than you did before. So thank you, everyone. And